In the winter of 1943, a lone figure waits in line at a Gestapo checkpoint in Paris, a basket of bread hanging from one arm. Officers swarm the narrow street, stopping pedestrians, rifling through bags, barking demands for identification. They're hunting an Allied spy who has blown up rail lines, smuggled airmen home, and vanished every time without a trace. The Germans have given the ghost a name, the White Mouse. 5 million francs for capture, the highest bounty ever placed on a member of the resistance. For now, the figure stays calm, inching closer to the front. Inside the basket lie scraps of paper written in invisible ink. If the Gestapo finds them, dozens will die. The line lurches forward. An officer's hand shoots out, pointing at the basket. You. Open it. The figure lifts their chin, draws a quiet breath, and smiles politely, choosing the one weapon the enemy would never expect. Long before the war, in 1912, a girl was born in the seaside city of Wellington, who would one day become the most wanted woman in France. In the hillside suburb of Rosenheath, overlooking the harbor, Nancy Grace Augusta Wake was born on August 30th, being the youngest of 6 children. In 1914, the family crossed the Tasman Sea to settle in North Sydney. Not long after, her father, Charles Wake, abandoned them. He went back to New Zealand, never to return. Her mother, Ella, was left to raise 6 children alone. From that moment on, her mother's warmth vanished, replaced by a distant, icy demeanor. That day, Nancy realized that trusting the wrong person could come at a steep cost. Left without affection or emotional support, Nancy quietly became self-reliant. She cooked, cleaned, and earned her own money. At 16, she ran away from home and turned to nursing for work. The job provided income, but the hospital walls felt confining. Her ambition stretched far beyond them. With nothing holding her back at home or work, Nancy seized any chance to set out for a life she imagined could be bigger than anything she'd known. A modest inheritance of £200 from an aunt, about $10,000 in today's money, gave her a ticket to freedom. At 19, she boarded a ship bound for North America and landed in New York, just as Prohibition gripped the city. She later joked, quote, "I'd never consumed so much alcohol in my short life. People were making it in bathtubs." After burning through the novelty of speakeasies, Nancy left the U.S. behind, eager to find a place where her ambition and curiosity could truly take flight. At the age of 20, she was in London studying journalism. Desperate for her first paid assignment, she told a hiring manager, an Egypt enthusiast, that she too loved Egyptology. When pressed, she bluffed, scribbling nonsense on a page and claiming it was Arabic. He believed her, and she got the job. From London, Nancy moved to Paris, chasing work as a freelance correspondent. She would hunt for a story first, then find a paper to buy it. One article could pay her rent for 6 months, leaving the rest for clothes, jewelry, travel, and the endless whirl of Parisian parties. During these years, she learned French, mapped train and bus routes across the country, and absorbed a culture that would soon become home. After Hitler's rise to power in 1933, streams of refugees, Jews, intellectuals, or former politicians fled to the city, desperate for visas to England, America, or anywhere beyond Germany's reach. Nancy and her circle of young writers befriended several of them, hearing first-hand accounts of the regime's brutality. The stories were grim, but they grew darker still when Nancy decided to see for herself. In 1934, she joined fellow journalists on a trip to Vienna. There, she witnessed disturbing scenes that stayed with her for the rest of her life. She saw groups of Jews publicly abused, whipped, and humiliated. She was horrified, and in that moment resolved that if she ever had the chance, she would do anything, no matter how small or dangerous, to oppose the Nazi regime. A later visit to Berlin deepened that loathing. Brown shirts swaggered through the streets, cracking whips against their boots, assaulting shopkeepers while their comrades vandalized windows and tossed belongings into blazing piles. Nancy left the city shaken, sickened not only by the violence, but by the silence of the outside world. The roar of German engines rolled across the countryside of France in 1940 as Wehrmacht tanks tore through towns and villages. Paris fell with shocking speed, its streets once alive with laughter, now tense with fear and suspicion. By then, Nancy was already married to Henri Fiocca, a wealthy industrialist she'd met years earlier in Marseille. Nancy's status as the wife of a wealthy Frenchman provided cover for her resistance activities, as the prevailing stereotype assumed women of her social standing would be unlikely to engage in clandestine operations. When the war dragged on, their apartment became a hub of provisions and visitors. They hauled tinned food, sacks of coffee, and crates of wine, all shared with those less fortunate. Even amidst feasts and laughter, Nancy never lost sight of the growing danger. As chaos spread, France was desperate for ambulances and drivers, and Nancy caught Henri in a fleeting tipsy moment, securing his promise to buy a vehicle she could convert. She soon became a voluntary ambulance driver. Every day, she had to face visions of refugees streaming south in a torrent of fear. Belgian families escaping German strafing runs, children buried under rubble, and civilians trapped in the chaos of war. Using the ambulance, she transported Dunkirk survivors, Allied soldiers, and Jewish refugees out of danger. She paid exorbitant bribes to free captives from local authorities and became a dependable courier, slipping through checkpoints, moving intelligence, and ferrying escapees along secret routes. As the front collapsed and German forces advanced, her work grew even more urgent. She eventually had to retreat south to Marseille and Nîmes. Shortly after, Nancy joined the escape network of Captain Ian Garrow, initially entrusted with delivering coded messages. Meanwhile, France was falling apart. Marshal Philippe Pétain headed the Vichy government, pushing for cooperation with the Germans, while Charles de Gaulle worked to organize war veterans into the French resistance. Pro-Nazi groups, especially the Milice, infiltrated resistance networks, turning every mission into a dangerous gamble. What had begun as discreet assistance quickly evolved into full-fledged operations, requiring careful planning and courage. Nancy and Henri found themselves at the heart of the resistance, and their roles gradually deepened. They now assisted safe houses for Allied soldiers and refugees, preparing them for the treacherous journey over the Pyrenees on the Freedom Trail. Still, Nancy soon grew increasingly cautious of those around her. A tense encounter with a man named Paul Cole, whose behavior suggested he was a Gestapo spy, confirmed her instincts. When she tried to warn Garrow not to trust him, he dismissed her concerns, calling her oversensitive. The encounter opened her eyes. She realized Garrow had been exploiting her resources, treating her and Henri as little more than a bank account for the Resistance's needs. Determined to regain control of her contributions, Nancy began distancing herself from Garrow. She focused instead on aiding Albert Garis, a Belgian doctor who ran the escape network that would later take his codename, the Pat O'Leary Line. With him, Nancy was able to provide and coordinate safe houses of her own, while managing escape routes and shepherding Allied soldiers and refugees across occupied France. When Wehrmacht troops occupied all of Vichy France in November 1942, the network was betrayed, primarily due to the actions of double agent Paul Cole and infiltrator Roger Leneveux, leading to the arrest of key members. As a result, Nancy fled while her husband remained behind. He was identified as a person of interest due to his connection to Nancy and their involvement with the resistance. Captured by the German secret police, he endured brutal interrogation designed to extract information about networks, safe houses, and escape routes. Despite the unimaginable pain and relentless questioning, Henri refused to betray anyone. Soon after, Nancy became the Gestapo's obsession. So adept was she at evading capture that they dubbed her the White Mouse. Slipping unseen through cracks, she always managed to evade their traps. Raids would descend on safe houses minutes after she had left. Trains were stopped and searched, but Nancy had already stepped off at an earlier station. Messages were intercepted, networks rolled up, but somehow she remained out of reach. Nancy herself described the tactics that kept her alive as, quote, a little powder and a little drink on the way, and I'd pass their posts and wink and say, "Do you want to search me?" However, in early 1943, while trying to leave France, she boarded a train bound south. At a stop in Toulouse, German security forces swarmed the carriages, dragging passengers out for inspection. Nancy was swept up in the mass arrest, becoming one of just dozens herded into detention. The Gestapo knew of her, but no one had managed to put a face to the name yet. To them, she was another suspicious traveler. For 4 tense days, she sat in a cell, interrogated, prodded for inconsistencies, her fate hanging by a thread. Then Albert Garis stepped in. The Belgian doctor played a hand as bold as it was absurd. He claimed Nancy was his mistress, arrested only because she'd been trying to hide an affair from her husband. The story was scandalous, humiliating, and utterly false, but convincing enough to win her release. The Gestapo, eager to avoid the embarrassment of detaining a mere adulteress, let her go. Later that year, Wake topped the Gestapo's most wanted list, a 5-million-franc bounty on her head. As such, the resistance decided she must return to Britain. Slipping through the shadows, she first joined other fugitives on the perilous trek across the Pyrenees into Spain. Her first attempts to cross failed. German and Maquis patrols swarmed the frontier, forcing guides into hiding. Escape was delayed even further when her comrade, Marie-Louise Dessart, known by her codename Françoise, tasked her to help organize a daring prison break at Castres. A bribed guard and a bottle of drugged wine freed 10 prisoners, a Canadian, an American, and French resistance men among them. Wake spent days hiding them in Françoise's flat, secretly scrubbing their clothes while police scoured the city. The fugitives split for the journey south. On a train toward Perpignan, Nancy traveled with the Belgian doctor and 2 others. When the word came of a German inspection, Garis himself shouted for them to jump. Wake hurled herself through the window as machine guns opened up, sprinting uphill through vineyards with bullets snapping past until she collapsed on a ridge. Reuniting with Garis, she trekked to Canet-Plage, sleeping in barns and sheep pens, starving and half frozen. After recovering from scabies, she returned to Toulouse, only to see the doctor betrayed by a Gestapo agent and sent to Dachau. Nancy narrowly avoided arrest by posing as a flirtatious traveler. She regrouped in Nice, then boldly forced her way into the office of the man who controlled the escape guides in Perpignan, demanding help. Amused, he agreed. Hidden under coal sacks in a truck, Wake and her group finally began their crossing. They reached Spain, only to be arrested and jailed at Besalú in filthy conditions. Nancy tricked her interrogators, claiming to be American and wringing food and whiskey from them. At last, battered but alive, she reached England. She immediately joined Winston Churchill's Special Operations Executive, designed to unify the scattered bands of French resistance fighters, known as the Maquis, and coordinate their efforts to sabotage German forces and prepare France for the imminent D-Day invasion. Welcomed under the cover of the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry, Nancy became one of just 39 women in the French section, tasked with sabotage, espionage, and liaison work under Colonel Maurice Buckmaster, who coordinated operations with resistance networks across occupied France. Training began in Scotland, and the first stage tested endurance. Exercises ran day and night, and many recruits didn't survive the grueling demands. Nancy threw herself into every challenge, her determination blazing her forward. Close combat instruction taught hand-to-hand techniques, including strikes to vital points, while explosives courses covered demolition, improvised devices, and fuse timing. She mastered parachuting into cold English fields, wireless coding, Morse transmissions, and fieldcraft, all with a precision and speed that astonished her instructors. False identity exercises simulated real-world operations in occupied territory. Nancy memorized multiple cover stories, assumed a British identity, secured jobs, and contacted resistance sympathizers, all while evading surveillance. She learned to detect when she was being watched, navigate police scrutiny, and move with confidence under pressure. Her instructors, seasoned men, often muttered in disbelief that she was not only keeping pace, but was outshining them. Vera Atkins, overseeing female agents bound for France, remembered her vividly as, quote, a real Australian bombshell. Tremendous vitality, flashing eyes. Everything she did well. By the end of her training, Nancy Wake had become a master saboteur, a guerrilla commander, and a shadow warrior ready to strike deep into occupied France. On the night of April 29th, 1944, the dark skies of Auvergne stretched endlessly above. Nancy clutched her pack as the wind tore past her, the cold biting through her SOE-issued jumpsuit. Her mind focused entirely on the landing. Injury was the only failure she would accept. She landed tangled in a tree, drawing laughter and a sharp quip from Henri Tardeva, a local Maquis leader, quote, "I hope that all the trees in France bear such beautiful fruit this year." Soon after, she set out with SOE partner John Farmer to meet Henri Fournier, a hotel manager who had risen to lead the Maquis. The first days were tense. With no wireless operator to contact London, supplies and orders were delayed, leaving them in a precarious position. Émile Couloudon, known as Gaspard, the local Maquis commander, dispatched them to Chaux d'Aguet, seemingly indifferent to their struggles. When they finally met him, Fournier welcomed them warmly, setting up a freezing, sparsely supplied base in the hills of Lyotard. Hours stretched, anxiety mounting, until Denis Roch, the long-overdue radio operator of the team, arrived, bringing with him the lifeline to London. With Roch in place, Nancy began coordinating parachute drops of weapons, explosives, and cash. Nancy lived a near-sleepless, on-the-move existence, hopping between Maquis units, motivating fighters, training recruits, and planning operations. Her work extended to rooting out traitors, securing safe passages, and navigating the treacherous political dynamics of resistance leaders. By the eve of D-Day, her meticulous organization had transformed the Maquis from a ragtag group into a disciplined force of over 7,000 men ready to strike the German army. A couple of months prior, Gaspard declared a general mobilization to show the world that the resistance could liberate French territory on its own. However, the Germans were watching. On June 2nd, they launched a probing attack on Montmouchet, testing the Maquis' strength. Despite being outnumbered and lightly armed, the Maquis held their ground. They fired from hidden positions, disappeared into the terrain, and struck wherever the enemy faltered. Casualties mounted on both sides, though the Maquis' intimate knowledge of the mountains gave them a critical edge. After hours of testing, the Germans withdrew, assessing the resilience and skill of Gaspard's fighters. The night of June 10th, the enemy returned in full force. Over 11,000 troops, equipped with artillery, tanks, and armored cars, were deployed against Gaspard's lightly armed 3,000 men. Miraculously, the Maquis captured an armored vehicle and 2 cannons. From Chaux d'Aguet, Nancy Wake and her SOE team could only listen to the cacophony of battle. Instead, they focused on the vital work of arming new recruits streaming into the region, distributing weapons, and coordinating airdrops from Allied planes. Nancy oversaw logistics. She fitted men with boots, unpacked containers, and ensured weapons were cleaned and ready. Another SOE member, Bazooka, real name René Dussac, drilled recruits in marksmanship, while Roch tirelessly coded and decoded messages, maintaining the lifeline to London. As night fell, the Germans withdrew, allowing the resistance to move vehicles, supplies, and clothing to safer ground. However, at dawn, the assault was reignited. For hours, the Maquis held their positions. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, they inflicted heavy losses. Reports later counted over 1,400 Germans had been downed, and many more wounded. Still, by June 20th, the Germans encircled Montmouchet, forcing a costly retreat. As the Maquis fell back, Nancy and her team led them on a grueling 3-day, 150-kilometer retreat westward to Saint-Sautin. They moved undercover, evading patrols, using hidden paths and river crossings ingeniously prepared by Fournier's men. During the flight from the Germans, Denis Roch had abandoned his bulky wireless set and codes to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. The freelance team was cut off from London, isolated, and under growing pressure from German patrols. Without a functioning radio, their ability to coordinate arms drops sabotage missions, or request reinforcements hung in the balance. Fortunately, through local contacts, Nancy Wake learned of a free French operator just over the adjacent mountain. A Maquis lent her a bicycle and helped her push it up the first incline. After pedaling 20 kilometers, she learned the operator had already fled because of heightened German activity in the area. Rock then remembered a radio operator in Châteauroux and passed on all the details he could recall. He was more than 200 kilometers away. The only way to reach him quickly and without drawing German suspicion was for Nancy to go herself on the bike. Everyone tried to dissuade her, warning that the distance was too great, the roadblocks too tight, and her papers too dubious to get her through. She refused to back down. This was their only chance. However, if she were to ride straight through the heart of occupied France, she would need to look the part of an ordinary woman on an ordinary errand. As such, Nancy mended her clothes, obtained a new outfit from a sympathetic tailor in Aurillac, and acquired shoes through black market channels, all while evading Millie's scrutiny. Disguised, she traveled all the way to Aurillac, roughly 40 kilometers from her starting point. Even as German patrols scrutinized town streets, she slipped past unnoticed, pedaling tirelessly across towns, fields, and markets. Upon reaching Châteauroux, she located a Maquis contact who coordinated with the Free French radio operator, allowing Nancy to finally send a message to London via Algiers. She asked for immediate replacement equipment and a trained operator. She also requested urgent coordination for weapons drops and instructions to support upcoming sabotage against German convoys and infrastructure in the region. Exhausted but undeterred, she began the return trip, navigating the same 200-kilometer route with no rest, avoiding patrols, and relying on previously arranged signals from villagers. After 72 grueling hours and 500 kilometers of cycling through enemy territory, she arrived in Saint-Certain, raw, blistered, and utterly spent, but triumphant. Within hours, Nancy was back in the field, reunited with Henri Tardiva, the man who had once cut her parachute free from a tree, and the newly reinforced SOE team in the Allier. They wasted no time. Arms dropped by Allied aircraft had to be retrieved, sorted, and distributed. Recruits needed training in sabotage, ambushes, and demolitions. Nancy threw herself into the work, coordinating weapons across scattered Maquis bands, planning attacks on convoys, and directing patrols to cripple German communications. The tempo only increased with new arrivals. In July, a fresh operator named Roger, a 19-year-old American Marine, appeared with two compatriots in tow. Neither spoke French, but their sharp uniforms and unflappable confidence won over the guerrillas. More importantly, they proved natural instructors, sharpening the ragged Maquis into a more disciplined force. When the group led the Americans to quarters Nancy and Rock had prepared, one asked casually whether they'd ever come under fire. Nancy, with a wry smile, admitted they had seen action just the day before. Just a few hours later, the crackle of gunfire at the back door jolted Nancy awake. She shouted for the Americans to move as German troops pressed the attack. 200 resistance fighters scattered into the olive groves and vineyards, leaving Nancy and Rock to oversee the evacuation and ready the vehicles for retreat. With Nancy translating under fire, the Americans knocked out several German posts before their ammunition ran dry. 7 fighters were lost in the skirmish. The wounded were ferried to sympathetic hospitals, where the survivors regrouped for the next fight. As soon as the shooting stopped, Nancy insisted on going straight to Marseille to check on her local contacts. In the following days, the team launched a series of raids on German convoys, sabotaging vehicles and disrupting supply lines. They coordinated airdrops of arms and equipment, ensured the reception and distribution of parachuted material, and trained recruits in ambush tactics and improvised defenses. Amid the flurry of raids, Nancy joined the team on one of their boldest missions, an assault on the Gestapo headquarters in Montluçon, the very heart of enemy power in the region, carried out in broad daylight. Tardiva and his men had meticulously planned the operation from start to finish, hiding all weapons and explosives in a nearby house, ready for a strike just after noon when the Germans were enjoying their pre-lunch drinks. Each participant had specific orders, and Nancy's task was simple in concept but perilous in execution. She entered the building through the back door, raced up the stairs, threw grenades into the first room along the corridor, slammed the door, and sprinted back to her car, waiting for a fast getaway. The headquarters was left in ruins, and dozens of German soldiers never made it to lunch that day. The aftermath required her and her team to convince nearby residents that the Allies had not landed, urging them to return home and remain indoors while the mayhem settled. The Maquis and Allier, prepared by Nancy's careful planning, immediately set about sabotaging bridges, roads, railways, factories, and communications lines to disrupt German defenses. All targets were destroyed, except a synthetic petrol plant at Saint-Hilaire. Tardiva, having seized the plant's fuel output 2 months prior, argued that the facility could be preserved as long as its stock remained out of German hands. London approved, and Nancy's team visited the plant manager to enforce compliance. Initially uncooperative, the manager was escorted to the distillery and then the boardroom, where he was warned of severe consequences for failing to cooperate, including arrest under Maquis authority. Trembling, he agreed to reserve the entire fuel output for the resistance. Nancy noticed discrepancies in the figures he offered and pointed them out. To everyone's surprise, he adjusted the numbers upward, ensuring the Maquis received the full supply. The plant was left under a small watch, its manager now fully compliant. Victorious and flushed with adrenaline, the team celebrated their unlikely triumph at the nearest bistro, joking that they were now, quote, oil kings. Everyone knew the war was drawing to a close. The Allies were about to land. German forces were retreating on multiple fronts, and liberation felt inevitable. Yet in the mountains of France, there was still work to be done. It was then that Nancy learned from a Maquis informant that 3 women were being held nearby, 2 French, and 1 suspected of spying for the Germans. Enraged, Wake threatened to disarm the Maquis if the women were not released into her custody. The French girls were set free without incident, but the spy would not be spared. Nancy interrogated her, uncovering her mission for the Gestapo. The girl spat and cursed as Wake delivered the sentence. She would be executed. The Maquis balked at shooting a woman, but when Nancy declared she would do it herself, they reluctantly formed a firing squad. During July and August 1944, Nancy moved ceaselessly across the forests of Allier and Puy-de-Dôme, organizing arms drops, arming Maquis groups, and sabotaging German convoys. Her coordination with Tardiva and other leaders turned the region into a minefield for the retreating enemy. On a Maquis raid against a German supply post, an SS sentry caught sight of her. Nancy struck first, and with a single judo blow from her SOE training, ended his life instantly, preventing the alarm from being raised. Not long after, the long-awaited invasion of southern France became reality on August 15th. Nearly 300,000 Allied troops, including Americans, British, Canadians, and French, landed between Toulon and Caen. On their final push, the Maquis struck, blowing bridges, ambushing convoys, and sabotaging railways. They aimed to have retreating Germans feel the terror they had once inflicted. Tardiva, Wake's mentor and steadfast ally, had been gravely wounded during a daring ambush on a German convoy. While leading his men through a narrow forest pass, a hidden machine gun nest opened fire, tearing through the undergrowth. Bullets shredded the air around him, and shrapnel tore into his leg, forcing him to collapse to the ground. Despite his injuries, he continued to direct the attack, shouting orders, coordinating counterfire, and ensuring that the remaining convoy vehicles were destroyed. Only after the Germans retreated could he be carried to safety, pale and in shock, his leg irreparably damaged. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Nancy Wake's courage was recognized with the George Medal from Britain, the U.S. Medal of Freedom, the French Medal of the Resistance, and 3 awards of the Croix de Guerre. It was also then, amid celebrations, that she learned her husband had been executed by the Gestapo. Despite the weight of her grief, Nancy soon redirected her energy toward rebuilding the world she'd risked everything to free. She spent a brief period with the British Air Ministry, working at embassies in Paris and Prague to help guide post-war intelligence efforts. Afterward, she returned to England and took up a position as an intelligence officer at Whitehall, a role she held until 1957, when she married RAF officer John Forward. Together, they settled in Australia. Civilian life never came easy. The urgency of war had given way to bureaucracy and loss, leaving Nancy to face a different kind of struggle: the quiet, complicated battles of peace.